Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased that I have the brief opportunity on behalf of my caucus to speak on this bill, of course, because of the closure that this government's brought in on this very important bill. And this debate will end today, and we won't hear any more about it. Second reading of bills is to talk about the content of the bill, to come to grips with whether you support it or not support it. I'm very pleased as well to be right now splitting my time with the member from Abitibi, Baie, James, Nunavik, and Eeyou. Between the two of us, I think we have over 100 years of time in northern communities across this vast land. My colleague, his knowledge and understanding of that should be of great interest to everyone in this House. And I just want to speak a little bit about my experience, Mr. Speaker. I grew up in the north. My first school in grade 1 was the Fort Smith Federal Day School, run by the Government of Canada. It had 2 residential schools attached to it, Brainerd Hall and Grandin College. Both of those, I grew up through the system with residential school survivors, many who weren't survivors because many of my classmates came to untimely ends due to social conditions, due to and the residential apology that took place was a very emotional moment for me because, of course, I recognized that so much had happened to First Nations people across the country and very personal to me. My experience also includes being the chair of a local school society which had over 50% of the students were Aboriginal students. I was chair of the NWT Aurora College Board of Governors. That college was solely dedicated toward, its great dedication is towards putting Aboriginal students into career positions, and very successful at doing that. So I understand the systems that we have set up in the Northwest Territories to deal with education in small and remote communities. And Mr. Speaker, I moved to the report of the National Panel on First Nation Elementary and Secondary Education of Student on Reserves. And I want to keep my remarks to funding, really, because I think that's an area that I find, as in my experience, has always been a very important area to talk about when you're talking about schools in remote and isolated communities. They say statutory funding is needs-based, predictable, sustainable, and used specifically for educational purposes. First Nations education reform must be based on strong, positive educational outcomes, not on an average cost per student approach. Given the magnitude of barriers faced by First Nations learners, the level of resources and investment required per student will likely be substantially greater than the average level of expenditures provided in the public school system. And that's clearly the case in the Northwest Territories. Mr. Speaker, we have 8,500 students in our schools in remote and isolated communities, as well as in large communities like Yellowknife, Fort Smith, Hay River, and Nunavik. There, the average expenditure per student is $22,000 a year. Mr. Speaker, when I was chair of our local education society in 1985, the level of funding per student in the schools that I represented was equivalent to what this government is providing today for the students in residential schools, in First Nation schools across the country. So what we see is that really, and we're talking about schools that require greater levels of funding in order to provide the services. There is no question about that. There is no question about the fact that when you're dealing with a school in an isolated, remote situation where you have to work very hard to entice teachers to come there and teach, where you have to pay extraordinary high costs of servicing schools, where all the costs involved in providing education to a very small number of students is very high. This is simply the case. So when we look at what is done in Canada, where we have 143,000 First Nations children, and in 2011-2012, the Aboriginal Affairs spent about $1.5 billion total. Sounds like a big number. Mr. Speaker, for 8,500 students in the Northwest Territories, we spend in excess of $200 million a year. So when you're looking at what has happened in First Nations education, you have to look at the dollars. You have to look at the dollars and say, how can anyone provide those services that are required across this country in remote locations, away from cities, away from all the other things that allow the cost of providing those services to be reduced? How can that be expected? So what we have are schools that are chronically underfunded today. When we look at what the Conservatives are offering to put into the schools, starting in 2016, another $400 million per year on top of that, what we see is that the total amount provided in 2016 is far below what is really required to deal with those schools. Mr. Speaker, there's 515 on-reserve schools. Right now there's a $200 million budget for repairs and maintenance and for infrastructure for schools and classrooms for 515 schools. Wow. No wonder these schools are falling apart. Yeah. They simply can't do that work. This has been going on since the Liberals. It's going on for the last 20 or 30 years. You can, basically, we have never funded these schools properly. We have left them in a state of a situation where the schools are falling apart.
From Calgary said it didn't matter.
Well, that's just simply not the case. Yeah. When we talk about 515 schools and we have to replace a certain amount every 30 years, Mr. Speaker, what does it cost to replace a school these days? I would refer you to, especially in isolated and northern, in remote locations, I would refer you to some of the school replacements taking place in the Northwest Territories, where the average replacement cost is between 30 and 50 million for schools of 200 people. This is what we're talking. The average school on reserve is around 200 students. This is the costs we're talking about. If you're talking about a 30-year replacement plan, then those schools are going to eat up a heck of a lot more money than what you've got in the budget here for operations, for maintenance, for capital costs. So what we have is, and what we will continue to have, unless we recognize that this is a fundamentally underfunded situation that we have to add major dollars to. And I don't see the Liberals with their Kelowna Accord. This bill simply doesn't put the money where it's needed. We can spend billions of dollars a year upgrading our fighter fleet, but when it comes to upgrading our children's future, we're not willing to put that kind of dollars on the line. Mr. Speaker,
upholding our constitutional responsibility.
You know, this subject requires more debate, and I know I have 2 minutes to talk about this very important topic, to talk about what we're actually doing with this bill. It's very difficult, Mr. Speaker. I find it to be repugnant that that the Conservatives have called closure on this subject when there is so much to say. Yeah. There's so much to talk about here, Mr. Speaker, that the couple of days debate that we're taking at second reading is really ridiculous. I'm in some ways outraged by it. I find that, but it is a pattern of this government. When they put forward in their way to with all the lofty sounding principles that they put forward here, and when you start to dig into this bill and realize we're just simply going to continue the situation that exists today. There's simply not enough effort put into this to make the change. What we need is a watershed here of funding for these schools to bring them to a level that they can exist and they can provide the services that First Nations students require. We can talk, my colleagues will talk about all the other aspects in the bill if they would continue to talk about it if they had the chance. We don't have the chance to even get close to all the other subjects within this bill. So I thank, Mr. Speaker, I thank you for giving me this brief time here, and I appreciate my colleague will come with some more statements here very shortly, right after me, in fact, in the next few seconds, and I will look forward to hearing what he has to say as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.